Hey, g'day, it's Prezzo. Welcome back to my workshop today. Now, this is episode 3 of building a pair of Art Deco inspired wall lights or wall sconces. There's a playlist up above there now, and you can go back and check out the first 2 videos in this series. Now in today's video I'm going to finish up with the parts that I began in the last episode. I had some problems with those and we're going to try and resolve that today. And we're also going to look at the castings which go on top of these fabricated frames. So let's have a closer look. Since the last video I've gone ahead and I've done a part assembly on one of these lights. Now I did that because you have to think very carefully about how this assembly is going to be done when all of the fabrication and the finishing is complete. Now because these are wall lights, this rectangular frame here needs to attach to the wall, and it should be done in such a way that you don't see any fasteners. The wiring will have to pass through the back of that frame, come out through this side here, and then it's connected to the bulb holders top and bottom. Now at the same time, the glass diffuser around the front of this light fitting is made of 17 of these borosilicate glass tubes, and they are simply held captive between these top and bottom plates. But that effectively closes off the whole of the front of the light. So the question is, how do you insert the light bulbs? How do you change the light bulbs if one of them blows? How do you clean the interior of the light if it gets full of spider web and so on? And at the moment, everything is done from the back. All the assembly is done from the back. So there are screws which hold these plates on, and the screws which hold the casting and this little decorative riser on top will all be done from the inside. So, you know, that sort of complicates things, and you have to think ahead about how you're going to do the assembly. Now, I think I've resolved the problems, but it did mean a redesign on some of the parts, and I've had to sort of change my ideas about how the fasteners work. But we'll look at that at a later stage. Today I want to finish off these 2 parts here. I sort of did a rough fabrication of these in the last episode. They need to be cleaned up, and we're going to start work on the castings which go on the top and the bottom of this light. So I've done a CAD model, and these are the castings. The CAD model really only helped me design the form of this light. Now, what does it look like? It doesn't tell you how you're going to manufacture it, and it doesn't tell you how you're going to assemble it. And that is the problem with making what is essentially a prototype. And now I've done this one here, if I was doing it again, I'd be able to start from scratch and put all of that detail, all of the detail of how the fasteners work into this CAD model. But when I made this, I was just sort of guessing, and sometimes it comes back to haunt you. And that's certainly the case when I made this part here. I put 3 holes in this to put it on a fixture, and then realized later on that they had to be covered up or hidden in some way. That's what I'm going to show you today, how I'm going to do that, and then we'll get all of that finishing process done on these parts. In the last episode you would have witnessed my embarrassment when I realized that these 3 fixture holes were not going to be covered up by this part here, and that meant that I had to plug those 3 holes in each part. There are 4 of them altogether. So I went ahead and made up the little brass plugs and pushed them through from the inside, and they get silver soldered over on the outside. So I've still got this one to do, and I buffed the outside of that part there, and I've just done a light countersink around each one of those holes there with one of these Noga countersinking tools. And that means that when we silver solder over that position there, it will penetrate below the surface and we can sand that off flush. Now these parts are going to get electroplated, so it's really important that that is a dead flat finish when we're done. On the inside I've just cleaned the brass, and I've done a slight chamfer there as well, and we'll see if we can get these parts in now. They're a bit fiddly. 2 of these are a press fit, the other one's a bit loose. Alright, let's see if we can tap these 2 in. Okay, so if I turn that over now, you should be able to see that they've pushed right through. They're just slightly taller than the surrounding surface there, so we can sand it all off flush when we're done. I did have to stake around this one here. That was the loose one. So I just got a center punch, just made a few punch marks to push the material in and hold that plug in place. Okay, well that's turned out okay. That excess silver solder will come off. We'll get a nice flat finish on that part there. These two here still need to be processed, so we'll get that done and then we'll talk about the castings. What I'll do now is get all these parts cleaned up using this belt. This is a 2x36 belt, 120 grit, but I also have a selection of other belts going up to 320 grit. And the idea is you start with your coarse abrasive and work your way through the finer abrasives as you go. So initially we're just sort of removing the waste, and then we'll start with the actual polishing process. Now the thing is though that this produces a lot of extremely fine dust. And the brass dust gets up your nose, gets in the back of your throat. It's very, very unpleasant. So I'm going to be using a mask. So once it gets started, I won't talk about it, I'll just do it. Okay, that sort of takes care of that edge. There was a little bit of material protruding around here which needed to come off, and what I need to do now is to sand this surface here dead flat. Now where I held these parts together with those little clamps, it's left very small depressions around the edge where the clamps were, and in order to get that flat you've got to remove some material. The only problem is that holding that against the belt with your fingertips so close to the belt means that the part gets very hot. It's also dangerous to have your fingertips that close there. So I made up these little push blocks. So this one was laser cut and just has a little handle glued to it, and it fits inside the part like that, so I can grip that more securely without worrying about my fingers. But I'll get this one sanded and I'll show you what I mean about those little depressions. Okay, I'm going to stop with that 120 grit belt, even though there's a patch there I haven't quite touched yet. When we change out to the 180 grit belt, we're still removing material, so they're still going to lower that surface and hopefully get rid of that mark. And the important thing here is that every time you change belts, you arrange it so the grit direction is at 90 degrees. And that allows you to see more readily whether you've left any deep scratches from the previous belt. Now we're going to go up to 320 grit with the belts, then I'm going to use an orbital or a random orbit sander to try and sort of just put a swirl pattern on it, and then we'll go to wet and dry up to 1000 grit. There are two of the parts I did yesterday, and I finished these with 4 different grits of belt. And what I meant to show in that video, I didn't show at all because it was a bit boring. But I started off with a 120 grit belt, and we did the 120 grit belt with the grit running that way. And then followed up with a 180 grit belt, and then we did the scratch marks that way. Then we switched over to a 240 grit, and we went this way. And finished up with the 360 going that way. So the idea was that each change of belt you can see whether you've removed all of the scratches from the previous coarser grit belt. And that's really important because when you go to the polishing stage, if there's a deep scratch there, you've got to go right back to that grit and get it out before you go up through the grits again. So it's very tedious and it's very frustrating when you get to the point where you're getting a high gloss polish on it and you see a deep scratch. This one here has also been done. The next step then is to go to a random orbit sander. I've got a 400 grit disc for that, and we'll just put sort of a random pattern over that, and then we can start with the actual wet and dry and get to the polishing stage. Now there's another thing that needs to be done. I've got to cut a pocket in this back plate here. That pocket is to clear the bulb holder, and I'll show you that in a moment. But I'm going to confess to another error at this point. I don't know if you can see that, but around that edge there I've actually exposed the silver solder joint. Now when I'm CNC machined this plate here, I accidentally set the tool path to cut 1.6 millimeters deep instead of 1 millimeter deep, and by the time I caught it, it was too late. It was already doing the second pass, and that meant that that pocket was almost through to this surface of the brass. And obviously when I sanded that, I've exposed that joint. Now it means that there's some little tiny pinholes there where the silver solder went through, so I'm going to have to put a layer of soft solder over that at a later stage and then sand that back so that we don't see those little pit marks. I can electroplate over soft solder, that's not a problem, and essentially it's like putting car body filler on a car before you paint it. Anyway, let's talk about this pocket and why we need that. So this is pretty much how I'm going to do the assembly of this light fitting at a later stage. So the bulb holders are attached to this rectangular frame from the back here with a couple of countersunk head screws, and that means I can do all of the wiring with the light off the wall. So I can connect together the 2 bulb holders. I can sort of put a plate in the back here with a terminal block so that I can join up to the mains power coming out of the wall. And these caps can then just simply slide on because that pocket there, they can just slide over that assembly, and then I can put a couple of screws through from the back here to hold them in place. So that just sort of makes the assembly of that part of it a little bit easier because you don't have to mess around with these bulb holders and trying to get them wired up at a later stage. So I'm going to do this on the Bridgeport mill. I'm just going to cut that little pocket there. It's pretty boring, but I'll just briefly show you how that works. And the other thing I want to talk about was how I'm going to assemble these glass tubes here. So let's have a close look at that. When I first started designing this slide, I realized it was really important that you could register all of these tubes in their correct positions around this bottom brass plate here. So I designed this part and 3D printed one as a draft, and I had already ordered the tubing. The eBay order said it was 10 millimeters diameter. When the tubing turned up, I decided to do a trial run and fit the tubing into those pockets there. And after I'd fitted about 6 of them around here, they started to bind up and get tight. Now it turns out that that 10 millimeter diameter is just a nominal size. Most of these tubes are slightly oversized, so as the error multiplies around this periphery here, that's why they started to get tight. Now at that point I thought I'd screwed up the whole design, because everything else, all of this brass work here, was dependent on fitting around this 3D printed part. So I had to think about it and realized that this outer edge here doesn't really need to be there. And I did this one here. Now I did get clear PETG filament because it's just less visible when you look through the diffuser. But with this one here, the tubes just sit in that ledge all the way around there, and there's enough clearance that they could sort of, you know, spread out a bit from that nominal 10 mil diameter, and I could fit all 17 tubes around there without a problem. But it's a bit of a nightmare to assemble it. The tubes want to slide around a bit, so I reinstated the back edge there, put the half pocket in, and these tubes can now fit in there, and there's just that little bit of clearance there, and that sort of helps me to get them all in there, keep them in position, but they're still going to fit. So at that point I sort of breathed a bit of a sigh of relief and realised we could keep moving forward with the design. Anyway, we'll need to go and get this part done on the mill now, so get that done and then we can sort of move forward with the polishing process. Before I clean this one up with the orbital sander, I want to solder these 2 brass nuts onto this plate here, and this just makes it easier to assemble later on. So when I push the screws through from the back, I won't have to fiddle around and try and hold those nuts in place while I do that. And I'm going to use one of these little sanding sticks. Now I got this at a woodworking show many years ago, and the company was called Burfitt Tools. That's B-U-R-F-I-T-T. And I bought them. There are actually 3 in the set, and they come with these little abrasive bands, and you can slide the band along. They're sort of spring loaded, so you can change the band if you need to, but they're excellent for doing this sort of work. So I'm going to get all the oxide cleaned off this material, get rid of the burrs that are there, and I'm going to just soft solder these nuts in place. So let me get this done and then we'll have a look at the rig that I've set up for soldering these. As you wear that belt out, you can just slide it along and get a new section. Okay, that should be enough. So what I need to do here is to make sure that the nut stays concentric with that drilled hole. So I've made up a little aluminium stub held in this old vise here, and that's going to locate the nut concentric with the drilled hole, and being aluminium it shouldn't allow the soft solder to stick. So I'm just going to place the nut over that stem there, push it down, and then we'll just put some acid flux on there, and we're just going to heat that with a gas flame. And just put a little bit of solder around the edge of the nut there, and it'll run underneath that surface. Alright, that's just going to make the whole assembly process later on a lot easier. There won't be as many bad words when we go to try and put this together. Okay, I'll give that a wash and we'll do the sanding on this one. So this is the one that we did just previously. It's been sanded up to 360 grit, and on my random orbit sander I've got a 400 grit disc, and what that will do is just put a non-linear pattern of scratches on that surface there. So we'll do this one and one of the small ones, and then that's as far as I'm going to go with the polishing at this stage. There's still a lot of work to go on these parts, and if I get a mirror finish on it now, it's going to get scratched anyway. So let's just leave it with that 400 grit disc, and then we'll come back to it later. So that's really all that needs at this stage. Now later, after I've done all of the casting and fitted all those parts, I'm going to come back and I've got strips of 600 grit wet and dry, I've got 800 and I've got 1000. And I'm just going to do these with a very small sanding block, something about that size there. Just work around and try and get like all of the fine scratches out of that. And then we go to the buffing machine to finish off, and then like a metal polish and a cloth. So, but that's all going to come later. It's no point in doing it now. I think for these small ones, they're a little bit awkward to put in the vise, so I'm just going to put a shaped block of wood inside that, just so I can grip onto it, and we'll push the stock, the brass part, against the face of the disc here in the vise. And again, I think that's good enough. I can't, yes I can. I was just about to say I can't see any scratches, but I can. There's a few there. We'll just do it a bit more. Okay, I think that's got it. No, let's see it in the camera actually. Where is it? There, right there. Okay, I think I've got it, and it just goes to show you if you miss a scratch, damn it, it's still there. It's still there. Or is it? Yep, it's still there. Alright, I think I've got it now. But it just shows you if you miss a deep scratch and you go past this point and you start working, say 800 grit wet and dry, and you see the scratch, you've got to come back to this point and keep going with this. So it's best to inspect it really carefully and make sure you're thorough. Okay, let's go on now. We're going to make the cores, which will go inside the castings that fit on top of this part here. Okay, this is my plan for making this casting. So this split pattern here will make two castings. One is there, one is there. This is a core print, and this is the core box. Now the core box is printed in PLA. I'm not going to worry about painting this because basically when the core is done, you just break it up and throw it away, and it's all internal to the casting anyway. This one here has been filled and painted so you get a smooth finish on the outside of the casting when we're done. Now, I don't use sodium silicate to make my cores. I use an epoxy resin mixed up with sand. Ratio is about 8% epoxy resin to sand. So what I'll do now is I'm going to pour sand into this core box, and then we're going to weigh that and work out how much resin we need. Now, these core boxes are made so that they're flexible. These splits here are so that when the core has cured, you can just simply flex the box away from the core. And I've also modelled in some little bevels there so I can get a blade or a scraper or something into these bevels here and sort of prise the box open. So after I've weighed the amount of sand we need, we're going to put a mould release on this section of the core box, pack the sand and epoxy in there and let it cure overnight, and then hopefully we can take a beautiful pristine core which will go in place of this part here when we make up the mould. Okay, so about 160 grams of sand. I'll add a bit extra, we'll make it up to say 200. That's close enough. So according to my calculator, we need 16 grams of epoxy. For the mould release, just so the epoxy doesn't stick, I'm just using this stuff. It's a beeswax and orange oil. Seems to do a pretty good job. You can sort of slather it on pretty well. Remember, we're not after a really fine surface finish on this core. So if there's a bit of excess wax and oil there, it doesn't really matter. So I'll put this back together, I'll tape underneath again, and then I'm going to put some MDF blocks on either side of this and clamp it, because this can flex a bit. And we don't want that to happen. We don't want this to open up when we pack the sand in there. So I'm just going to put a couple of clamps on there, and that'll hold that and make it stable while we pack the sand in there. That should be fine. So I said 8% is roughly the amount of epoxy that you need. Doesn't really matter what sort of epoxy it is, it's just a binder. Don't have to worry about getting the air bubbles out or anything like that, but you do need to mix it thoroughly. And then you just keep adding it to the sand until you get that sort of consistency where it'll pack in. So although I've mixed up more resin than I need, I probably won't use it all. I'm just going to sort of pour a bit in and just keep mixing it until it looks about right. So this is the sand that we measured out. So I'll pour about half that epoxy in there and just see how it looks. That's probably about right, actually. So this is a bit like making green sand. So you should be able to grab a handful of that and squeeze it together, and it sort of should form a cohesive lump. And you don't want any pockets of wet resin in there either. So make sure it's mixed all the way to the corners. Put a little bit more resin in there. So you might be asking yourself, why don't I use sodium silicate? Well, it's just because you've got to keep a cylinder of CO2 gas on hand to harden that sodium silicate. I keep this epoxy and it lasts forever, and it's relatively cheap, a lot cheaper than keeping a cylinder of gas on hand, and it works. The only downside is you need to wait overnight for this stuff to cure. Okay, I think that's good. Let's pack it into the mold. Alright, I'm going to leave that there. What I will do though is I'm just going to poke a wire down here to make a couple of vents. And we'll leave that till tomorrow, and we can give it a clean up. You can sort of lightly sand the surface of that if there's any sort of leftover sand and lumps on top. Alright, it's the next day. So I'll just pull this one apart. See how it looks. So you can see where I printed in these little chamfers on this edge here. It means I can put something in there and just wedge that open. Okay, that's pretty promising. Okay, so there's that core, and the good thing about these is they're really tough. You know, they can take a lot of abuse, and all I need to do now is just sand off these little ridges along here. I'll make 3 of these. I only need 2, but I'm expecting that I'll have a failure. So it's no problem to make 3 of these. Right, well here's our split pattern, and I think you can see how this is going to work. After we've rammed up the mold and removed this pattern, the core will just simply sit on this ledge inside the sand mold. So it should be fairly easy to insert that, and what that means is that when we pour the molten brass into the mold, we won't need so much to fill the cavity. The finished castings will be a lot lighter, and I'm hoping that it will reduce the shrinkage in these parts. But that's going to be next time. I think I've run out of time in today's video, so let me wind up and then we'll call it quits there. Well, it's now a day after this last section of video I just showed you, and during that time I've got 2 of these cores finished, and they're nice and cured and hard. Got a 3rd one in the core box curing now, and in the next video when you come back, hopefully, we're going to see how those cores perform with the high temperature of brass in the foundry. Now I've done it before and it did work, so I'm hoping I get the same result next time around, but yeah, that's all happening in the next video. Now I'm also just updating my world map. Now a few viewers got in touch recently and told me where they lived, and I promised I would update the map. So I'll bring you around in a minute and show you where we're at with that. And it's been absolutely miserable here today. The weather has been cold and wet and overcast, and they call Queensland the Sunshine State, but we haven't seen the sun for at least a week, and it's so cold. I think it's like 6 degrees Celsius, and we've been up in the house all day with the air conditioning on. That's how bad it's been. Anyway, let's have a look at this map, and then I'll say goodbye. Okay, well, let's start in the UK, and I've got two new ones here. This one here is in Ireland. It's O'Callaghan's Mills, and Ireland has a little bit of space left on the map. But England, as you can see, pretty densely populated with pins. The other one is St Austell, or St Austell, I hope that's the correct pronunciation, but it's way down here on the southern, southwest tip of England. That's it there. Okay, where are we off to next? Let's go to the USA. Alrighty, so our two new ones, we've got Biloxi, which is down here on the north side of the Gulf of Mexico, and we've got West Plains, Missouri. So there it is in there. And I'm sorry if I got those slightly wrong. There's not a lot of detail on this map, and some of the place names aren't shown, so I just gave it my best guess to get those. Alright, let's head off to Colombia. And here we are here. Now this is a place called Medellin, and I checked this out on Google Maps, and it's a beautiful place. Got some absolutely stunning scenery and some beautiful architecture there. So I think that's the first one in Colombia, and as you can see, we got a few over this side of South America. But yeah, big place. Anyway, that's it. I'm going to say goodbye now, and I'm just going to scan over the rest of the map, and you might be able to see your pin there. If you don't see your place, let me know. And sorry if I haven't scanned the whole map. Okay, let's come down here to Africa. Let's head up to Canada. Got a few in Alaska. Oh, where to next? Northern Europe. And back down to Australia and New Zealand. So there you go. I'm keeping it up to date, I hope. Like I say, if you didn't see your pin there, sing out and I'll put it in for you. Okay, it's Prezzo signing out. I'm going to catch you next time. Please join me. We'll have some fun in the workshop. Okay, cheers.